Hello everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the Arrowify add-on for Blender. This add-on allows users to easily create animated arrows within Blender itself. It is very easy to use, but also offers high amounts of customizability so that you can get the arrows that you want in your scene. This was initially developed as an internal tool here at RR3D, but since then, we realized that nothing like this was available on the market, so we decided to make it into its own fully fledged add-on and release it to the public. Now let's take a look at the Blender Market page. As you can see, the full bundle is available for $50. This includes all of the assets packaged as an add-on, or if you don't want to buy all of the arrows, then you can buy them individually. But please note that if you buy the arrows individually, you will not be getting the add-on. You will be getting the arrows as assets that are compatible with the Blender internal asset manager. Alright, now let's take a look at how to install the add-on. This should be pretty straightforward. It installs just like any other add-on in Blender. You need to go to Edit, Preferences, go to the Add-ons tab, and then you need to install from disk. And if you do that, you should see the Arrowify add-on appear right here. And if you enable it, then you need to close this window and you need to restart Blender. Now, once you've restarted Blender, you should be able to see the Arrowify menu in the Add menu in Blender. Now let's take a look at what the add-on offers. There are 6 different setups that the user can input. By default, if you have nothing selected, then the add-on imports these arrows on a simple curve object. As you can see right here, this is the EEVEE arrows, and right out of the box, they're ready to use. However, if you already have a curve object or even a mesh line, then you can also apply the effects to already the pre-made path. So if I add a plane and I delete one of the vertices, then you can see here as an example, this could be a pre-made path that I want the arrows to take. And if I have this object selected and I press Shift A and I select, let's say, the simple arrows, then it will apply to this curve line. Now, all of the setups, they work both on mesh and curve objects. One important thing to note, however, is that in some cases, you might want to go into the curve settings and bump up the resolution so that you don't get very jagged arrows. So let's put this up to 36. All of the setups can be controlled from the modifier tab and the shader editor where you have a custom node group. Now, while in some cases, some controls might change, all of the arrows use some form of gradient to color the arrow and give it more visual weight. But there is also a lot of room for customization in order for you to get the arrows that you want to use. In most cases, we also exposed parameters. So in case you want to use a custom material, then if I go to, for example, these arrows right here, you can see that I have a gradient mask output here. And if I just take a look at that, that will give me the mask of the gradient. And the gradient is controlled by this object itself that the arrow effect is applied to, as you can see. And this allows you to control a custom material with the inbuilt gradient functions. So overall, it works out right out of the box, but there is also room for a lot of customization. So let's take a look at all of the arrow assets. First of all, let's take a look at EEVEE arrows. Now, these are the EEVEE arrows. The EEVEE arrows do not use any moving mesh to animate the arrows. Instead, they utilize an arrow image texture that is animated based on the EEVEE map of the generated mesh. Now, if I go into viewport shading, you can see that the generated mesh is this plane, and the arrow images are just that, image textures, but you can also use your own image texture And since this is a texture-based setup, most of the controls for this setup are going to be in the shader editor. And if I want a custom arrow mesh texture, then I can go to this custom node group called custom arrow texture. If I select it and I hit tab, then I can just switch out this image texture for whatever arrow I have, and that will automatically update the arrows in this main group. And then I just need to click use custom arrow. And as you can see, then it will switch to the custom arrow that I have selected. Now, apart from that, we have controls in the modifier tab. I will not go through all of these. Most of them are very self-explanatory, but if you do want extra information on what each setting does, please refer to the documentation. All right, so let's move on to the next arrows, to the simple arrows. These arrows, they actually use moving geometry. If I go into the viewport shading, then as you can see, if I hit play, then these arrows have actual moving geometry. The bulk of the settings for this are going to be in the modifier panel, but also we have controls for the color and the gradient in the shader editor. These arrows offer a lot of customizability. We have, if I recall correctly, almost 40 arrow presets. You can choose the different categories right here, and you can cycle through all of the different designs. But if you have something custom in mind, you can always use your own arrow object. You can also use a collection, so that if you have a collection of different arrows or different objects, you actually don't need to use arrows for this. One cool idea could be that if you have a conveyor and you need boxes to move along the conveyor, then you can just put those boxes into this arrow setup and it will move the boxes along the conveyor. And you can also randomize the order and the rotation and the scale of these objects. So this just really shows the flexibility where you don't even need to use these 4 arrows specifically. Anyway, one thing to note though is that this does not actually deform the arrows to the curve. This just rotates the arrows according to the curve direction. If you want arrows that actually deform to the curve, then you are looking for the morph arrows, which let's take a look at that now. So the morph arrows, these are very similar to the previous arrows that we looked at, which are the simple arrows, except that they actually deform to the curve. So let's say if I select something that allows us to see the deformation a bit better, and as you can see right here, it actually deforms to the corner right here. Even if I make the corner a bit more pronounced, then you can see that they really do deform to the curve. Now, one thing to note with this is that if you want to make custom arrows for this, you can really easily select your custom arrow, but you need the correct geometry for that. So if I go into wireframe mode, you can see that this arrow geometry allows the curve to really smoothly deform along the curve. So just keep that in mind if you're making a custom arrow for this setup. As usual, there's a lot of controls in the modifier setup, and there's the controls for the color and the different gradients inside of the shader editor, as well as the exposed parameters if you want to use a custom material for this setup. For example, if you want this to be more of a metallic arrow instead of an emissive material, then you can still color the metallic material using the gradient mask, and then you still have the easy to use controls for the gradient within this node group itself. Now, so far most of the arrows have been just individual arrows arrayed along a curve. However, the curve flow offers a slightly different look. So the curve flow randomly offsets arrows along a curve and it makes them move along the curve. I can very easily control the offset on how much the arrows are actually offset. I can use custom arrows as usual. And one thing with the smearing right here in the preview, EEVEE preview, you might want to turn off motion blur so that the preview actually looks good. The motion blur should be fine in final renders. I can also introduce some noise to the arrow movement. This is very good to visualize something like particles moving through pipes or something like that in an industrial setting. For example, if I just increase this, you can see that the arrows, they do have some jitteriness, and I can also increase the noise speed on this. And yeah, you can introduce some chaos into the arrows. All right, let's take a look at the next arrow. This one is a personal favorite. It's called the arrow array. And as you can see, these are just an array of arrows that are extending from the selected geometry or curve, but you can actually give some shape to these arrows. So this is very good for visualizing the magnitudes of forces. If you have anything that's engineering related, bridges or something similar, this is very useful to actually visualize on how different forces are distributed along a certain object. And you can control everything concerning the animation. You can also control the shape. So you can have a more of a concave or more of a convex shape for the animation. You can also have more of a ping pong effect for the shape. One cool thing is that if we go here to the arrow scale variance, then actually the arrowhead, if I just decrease the speed, it will be easier to see, but actually the head of the arrow increases based on how much it has extended from the selected curve. And also if I go here into the shader editor to the shader controls, you can see I have a length gradient here that is checked, and if I uncheck that, then it will just have a regular gradient where the largest value is going to have red, but it's going to have that red value even when it is very small. However, if I check the length gradient, then it will color the arrows based on how much they have extended currently from the base curve. So this is just that little extra visualizing that I think is very cool. You also have plenty of customizability and options in the settings right here. But yeah, that's the arrow array. I think it is a very useful arrow type. Now for the last arrow, we have the area arrow. Now if you have nothing selected, this will import as a curved circle with this grid around it. Now what this setup does is this emits arrows from this grid in a grid-like pattern, and it emits them from this curved circle. And since this is built off of simulation and geometry nodes, you can actually move this curved circle around in real time, and it updates the simulation accordingly. And this is useful if you have a custom area that you want arrows emitted from, then this is perfect for that, since you can just draw out that area using this curved circle. If you don't want the arrows to be emitted as a grid, you can have them emitted randomly. And if you do have them emitted randomly, then you can also add random velocity to the arrows. So if I check random velocity and I add some random velocity, so let's say 0.2 here, 0.2, and negative 0.2 here, then you can see the arrows have a random velocity. And if I just bump up the density to something like 1, then you can really see how this random velocity influences the arrows. Now, as you can see, the arrows just have an initial random velocity and they kind of stick to that velocity. And this is why we can mix in some noise. If I bump up the noise strength to, let's say, something like 0.5, then you can see that the arrows, they start to also change their velocity and kind of group together in this really cool manner. However, keep in mind that the random velocity does not work with the grid emission. If we turn off random velocity, we can also have rotation on these arrows. For example, if I have a chevron arrow, you can see that this is an arrow that is highly dependent on its rotation. Now, as usual, there are also the controls in the shader editor that are connected to the data from the geometry nodes. And here we have a lot of controls for the different gradients and the color, and also, as usual, the exposed parameter of the gradient. One thing to note with this area arrows is that the curve that you're using, it needs to actually close a loop, since the arrows are emitted from the area that is enclosed by the curve. So just make sure that the curve that you're using is cyclic. I hope you found this overview helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out on Blender Market, or by email, or by leaving a comment here on YouTube. Now, I hope that you found this overview helpful. If you like what you see and you want to have very easy to use arrow setups, then just go take a look at the Blender Market page. As I said at the start of the video, if you don't want all of the setups, then you can still just get one of them and then upgrade to the full pack later on. And also all of these arrows, they are made completely in Blender utilizing geometry nodes. If we take a look at the simple arrows, we go to the geometry node setup, you can see that we have this whole setup that is actually driving the arrow animation and everything. Of course, you do not need to deal with geometry nodes. We exposed all of the useful parameters here so that you can really just focus on making a custom arrow very quickly that you want. But if you want to take a look and see how we did all of these, then you're also welcome to take a look at the geometry node setup itself and maybe learn from it. Anyway, that's all for this video, and see you next time. Bye bye.